School Board to order. Ms. Aller, will you please take the roll?
Dr. Cavazos.
Here.
Ms. Chen.
Here.
Mrs. Donner.
Present.
Mr. Hosang.
Here.
Mrs. Hunley.
Here.
Mr. Riffle.
Here.
Mrs. Ortego.
Well, for anyone watching who's been watching for a while, you heard a lot of brand new names, and so I'd like to first off just welcome 4 new school board members, Mr. Hosang, Mr. Riffle, Mrs. Chen, and Dr. Cavazos. We're so glad to have you on our board, and of course welcome back Mrs. Hunley and Mrs. Donner, and look forward to working with each and every one of you this coming year. Can I get a motion to approve the agenda as presented?
Madam Chair, I move to approve the agenda as presented.
Is there a second?
Okay.
Thank you, Mrs. Hunley and Dr. Cavazos. Ms. Aller?
Mrs. Hunley.
Aye.
Mr. Riffle.
Aye.
Dr. Cavazos.
Aye.
Ms. Chen.
Aye.
Mrs. Donner.
Aye.
Mr. Hosang.
Aye.
Mrs. Ortego.
Aye.
And with that, I will turn this over to Dr. Heron.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, our Vice Chair. We are pleased to present some preliminary information on the budget for next year this evening, and to lead us off this evening, our Chief Financial Officer, Renee Ewing, will take lead. And she'll be joined by a couple of other senior staff members that will be introduced as we move through the presentation this evening. We'll stop at various junctures throughout the presenting the information to provide time for you to ask questions. There will be a lot of information tonight and a lot of information to reflect on before our second budget workshop in a couple of weeks' time. Ms. Ewing?
Actually, Dr. Heron, may I real quickly, Mrs. Hunley would like to read a statement.
Yes. As a member of the School Board of Williamsburg, James City County, I acknowledge that I may have an interest in the fiscal year 25 school budget because my husband is an employee of the WJCC schools. However, I believe that I am able to participate in the consideration of and vote on the budget fairly, objectively, and in the public interest.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Vice Chair. And I'd also like to welcome new board members tonight and returning board members. We're looking forward to working with you this year. Ms. Ewing?
Thank you, Dr. Heron. Good afternoon, Madam Vice Chair and board members. This afternoon, we will be presenting and discussing preliminary information related to the fiscal year 25 operating budget. And as we go through the presentation, other members from the senior leadership team will be joining us and sharing information from their respective areas as well. This is an overview of the items that we will be reviewing this afternoon. First will be background information related to the requirements for developing the budget, and we'll provide a brief overview of the budget process to date. We'll review the historical enrollment information as well as the projection for next year. And we'll then take a preliminary look at the items included in Governor Youngkin's budget, as well as review mandatory and essential operating expenditure increases to maintain current service levels. Normally, we would be sharing the expected amount of state funding for next year, but the budget calc tool has not yet been released by the Department of Education. We hope the information will be available to share at the next budget work session. There are a couple of state code sections that apply to school divisions, and the first one is Code Section 15.2-2503, Time for Preparation and Approval of Budget and Contents. This code section requires that on or before April 1st of each year, we must approve a budget of need to pass on to our governing bodies, both Williamsburg and James City County. The second state code section, 22.1-92, Estimate of Monies Needed for Public Schools, requires the superintendent, with the approval of the school board, to provide an estimate of the amount of money that is considered to be needed to support the public schools in the division, and that the budget must be set up by each major classification or category that has been prescribed by the Board of Education. We use our strategic plan's priorities to guide the development of the budget to ensure that the budget aligns with the goals of our strategic plan and that it supports the needs and goals of the school division, taking into consideration the input of our stakeholders. We will show the alignment with the goals of Elevate Beyond Excellence for the budget increases at our next budget work session on January 16th. In the October-November timeframe, we began collecting input from each school principal and each department administrator for the operating budget. At that time, they entered their requests into our financial system, and we then met with departments individually to discuss their requests and determine their needs. In December, we began discussing and evaluating the cost center requests with the superintendent's senior leadership team to ensure that what we present to you is indicative of necessity. This process will continue throughout this month as we will share additional information with you at the next budget work session on January 16th. We are presenting the items that were determined to be necessary to the division so that we may gather your opinion as to how those needs should be prioritized into a final budget. The Local Composite Index, or LCI, is the state's measurement of each locality's ability to pay for public education. The formula takes into consideration the changes in property values and taxes, the local income and retail sales, and compares it to that for the entire state. Each locality's index is adjusted to maintain an overall statewide local share of 45% and an overall state share of 55%. The maximum the LCI can be is 0.8. Much of our funding is derived from a per pupil cost multiplied by 1 minus the composite index. So, the lower the composite index results in more state funding, while a higher composite index would result in less state funding. The LCI is supposed to be an indicator of the wealth of the locality. If it goes up, the locality is deemed to have increased wealth and will be able to provide additional funding to support its programs. The LCI is updated at the start of each biennium, and since our school division serves 2 localities, we have 2 LCIs, both of which have increased for the new biennium. The City of Williamsburg's is increasing from .7217 to .7426, and James City County's is increasing from .5331 to .5403 for the 2024-2026 biennium. This chart is a historical view of the local composite index starting in 2007-8 through 2025-26. Williamsburg was consistently at the highest LCI of 0.8 until 17-18 when it started decreasing gradually each year and is starting to rise with the new biennium. James City County's LCI has been more volatile throughout the years, declining the past 2 bienniums and beginning to rise again with the new biennium. This chart shows a comparison of our LCI with divisions here on the peninsula, as well as 3 of the larger Region 2 divisions on the south side. As you can see, Williamsburg and James City County have the highest LCI of any locality in our area. Unfortunately, that means fewer state dollars for our schools and an increased dependence on our local funding partners. We have been very fortunate to have strong support for education from our funding partners over the years. Enrollment is based on our September 30th student count each year. This is a historical look at our enrollment from fiscal year 2016 until now. We had a steady increase in enrollment through fiscal year 2018, then enrollment leveled off for a couple of years at approximately 11,450 prior to the COVID-19 pandemic. We saw a decline in enrollment in fiscal year 21 to 10,858 due to the pandemic, but we've increased for a couple of years and are now up to 11,324. Each year, FutureThink prepares 10-year enrollment projections based on our September 30th enrollment information. These projections include a low, moderate, most likely, and high projection. Next year's projection ranges from a low of 11,256 to a high of 11,646. For many years, we used the low projection to develop our operating budget, but since COVID, we have been developing our budget based on the current year enrollment and plan to continue doing so for the fiscal year 25 budget cycle. Enrollment is slowly recovering after the decline due to the COVID-19 pandemic, and we believe the most conservative approach is to budget based on the students that we currently have. On December 20th, Governor Youngkin presented his budget proposals for the upcoming 2024-2026 biennium, as well as amendments to the current biennium budget. At this time, the Department of Education has not released the budget calc tool that school divisions rely on to provide specific funding information. We are hopeful that this information will be provided in the next week so that we have more detailed information to share with you at the January 16th budget work session. Some of the major items of interest related to K-12 funding include funds for the re-benchmarking of the standards of quality. This generally means updates to the input data like average salary used and the funding formulas that determine the cost of the programs. An example is the funded salary for SOQ positions. The elementary teacher's funded salary in the 2022-2024 biennium was $53,996. And for the 2024-2026 biennium, it is $61,514. Funds are also included to support the state share of one reading specialist position per 550 students in grades 4 and 5, and one reading specialist position per 1,100 students in grades 6 through 8, in accordance with legislation passed in 2023. Currently, we staff each of our elementary and middle schools with one reading specialist position. The governor's budget also proposes the state's share of a 1% bonus payment in fiscal year 25 for funded SOQ instructional and support positions. These funds do require a local match based on LCI. A 1% bonus for all WJCC staff costs approximately $1 million. We do not yet know the amount of state funding we would receive in support of this payment for fiscal year 25, but this was also a proposal in the governor's budget during the fiscal year 24 budget cycle. Last year, state funding would support approximately $320,000 of the cost, requiring $680,000 in local support to be able to fund this expenditure for all WJCC staff. So before moving on to expenditures, we wanted to pause here to see if there are any questions at this time.
Yeah, looking around, Mrs. Donner?
With the addition of a reading specialist, the one per grade for 4 and 5 and the 550, would that allow us to add more reading specialists to our current grouping, or how would that impact us?
I think we'd make that decision once we see the amount of money that's actually been allocated, because as with every position and every salary increase, the state only provides a small percentage of the overall cost, and the rest is based on the locality's ability to pay. So we're reviewing that now, looking at current positions, and once we translate this into, using the calc tool and see an actual amount of money, we'll begin to plan whether we add or whether we use the incoming funds to support the positions that all currently exist, and potentially use the funds for other positions we need to bring in. So there's lots of ways we may choose to present to the board for your consideration.
Thank you.
Anyone else have any questions at this point? Ms. Ewing, would you just clarify what SOQ funded means?
The standards of quality funded
Right.
positions.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the positions that the state pays a portion of based on average salary information and based on a locality's LCI.
And we have positions, other positions that the state does not contribute
Does not
to, right?
contribute to. Yes, ma'am.
Mrs. Donner?
Just, I think for clarification, and just since we've got new board members, so with the 1% bonus for SOQ instructional support positions, our view as a school division has always been that we don't just give the bonus to those that are in the SOQs, that we give that bonus to everyone. And so that is why there is kind of an increased cost.
Okay.
That's correct. So now we're going to take a look at mandatory and essential operating expenditure increases to maintain current service levels. And Mr. Baker is going to start off with information regarding compensation and WJCC vacancy trends.
Sure. Good afternoon. We wanted to start with some information that we shared in November. The starting salary of our neighboring school divisions for current bachelor's degree teachers is on the left of each grouping with a lighter shade, and as you progress to the right with a 1% increase for those beginning teachers. For the WJCC scenario, we show with each increasing bar what our salary would become if we were 1% more, 2% more, or 3% more than our neighboring school divisions. For the current school year, our bachelor's degree entry-level teacher earns $52,700, and in this example, those teachers would move to $53,227 with a 1% increase. On this slide, we show the starting salary for our neighboring school divisions for the current master's degree teachers on the left of each grouping with the lighter shades, and then progress to the right with a 1% increase for those beginning teachers. For the WJCC scenario, we show with each increasing bar what our salary would become if we were 1% more, 2% more, 3% more than our neighboring school divisions. For the current school year, our master's degree entry-level teacher earns $54,480. In this example, those teachers could move to $55,025 with a 1% increase. We shared these two slides as a reminder of where we rank with our key competitors as we prepare to hire and retain teachers for the upcoming school year. This year has been like no other in recent memory. We are seeing a new trend for this year with teachers resigning and retiring during the school year. Our goal was always to be 100% staffed, and traditionally we've hit that mark or come very close. But this year we've seen an increase in our teacher vacancies each month, with a low of 4 in August to 16 in December, and as of today we're still currently at 16. Hiring is not keeping pace with the resignations and retirements. And since September, we've had 15 teachers, we've hired 15 teachers, but we've had 26 resignations and retirements. Generally, teachers resign or retire at the end of a school year, but now this is the hiring season that never stops, and it's creating turmoil in our classrooms. Our yearly turnover trend data mirrors that for the state of Virginia. After declining during the first part of the pandemic, the number of our teachers leaving rose substantially since the 21-22 school year. Out of our departures in the past year, 70 were due to reasons that we don't influence, including retirements, relocations, and family care needs. Excluding those departures, our retention rate is over 90% for the teaching staff. Including all teacher departures, we retained about 84% of those, our teachers, which is consistent with the national average. To dig a little deeper into the data from the past school year, we had 172 instructional staff resign or retire in 2023, and the year before that number was 148. Within that 172 teachers, we had 26 retire, 32 relocate, and 40 left the profession altogether. Bless you. An alarming figure is that 79%, or almost a half of those separations, were in the first 10 years of their service. Several of the stated reasons for some of those 79 teachers that left included we had 19 teachers say they've left us for more money for a neighboring school division. Other teachers cited career change. Some were leaving the profession to go to the private sector. Some were relocating. Some were staying at home. Some were citing work-life balances, and some were just overwhelmed. This amount of turnover makes it challenging to maintain a culture of excellence. On this slide, we show the starting salary of our neighboring school divisions and the College of William & Mary for our support staff on grade 4, which includes our custodians, cafeteria workers, and bus aides. For the WJCC scenario, we show with each increasing bar what our salary would become if we increased our hourly rate by $1, $1.25, and $1.50 to $2 compared to our neighbors and other school divisions. And this is important. Within this category, we currently have 44 openings. On this slide, we show the starting salary of our neighboring school divisions for the support staff on grade 6, which includes our level 1 teacher assistants. And these are the teacher assistants that have less than 48 hours of college credit or have not passed the Parapro Praxis test. For the WJCC scenario, we show with each increasing bar what our salary would become if we increased an hourly rate by $1, $1.25, $1.50, or $2 more compared to our neighboring school divisions. On this slide, we show the starting salary of our neighboring school divisions for our support staff on grade 7, which includes the level 2 teacher assistants and some clerical staff. Again, we show with each increasing bar what our salary would become if our hourly rate were increased by $1, $1.25, $1.50, or $2 more compared to our neighboring school divisions. And on this slide, we show the starting salary for our neighboring school divisions and for WADA for our support staff on grade 8, which includes our bus drivers. For the WJCC scenario, we show with each increasing bar what our starting salary would become if we increased it by $1, $1.25, $1.50, and $2 an hour compared to our neighbors. And again, this one's important because we currently have 27 school bus drivers when you include the contractors. Thank you.
Based on the information that Mr. Baker shared regarding compensation, our competitiveness with surrounding divisions, we wanted to show what a 1 to 3% salary increase would cost for all staff. These amounts do include fringe benefits based on current fiscal year 24 rates. Each 1% in salary increase costs approximately $1.2 million. In order to maintain our adopted class size ratios for middle school, 2 additional teachers will be needed next year at an estimated cost of $160,000 to serve our middle school students. And Dr. Brown will now join us to share information related to special education staffing.
Good afternoon. In order to provide context to the special education mandated needs, we will begin by looking at the special education population trends. The numbers presented here represent students receiving special education services as documented on the December 1 state reporting account or document, which is used to determine state and federal funding for special education for the next fiscal year. The December 1 count for this year shows an increase of 123 students. This slide highlights the increasing special education population at Bright Beginnings, along with students in grades kindergarten through 12. It is important to note that the overall percentage of enrolled K through 12 students receiving services through an IEP is just over 15.8% of our student population. Looking at this year's data, the number of caseloads above caseload capacity maximum is at 10. These caseload numbers adjust monthly based on revised IEPs requiring increased services, as well as transfer and newly eligible students. The trend shows these factors will continue to impact the caseload capacities for our teachers. The Department of Special Education will continue to monitor enrollment and caseloads throughout the first semester. It must be noted that the dedication of our special education teachers and support staff have allowed WJCC to continue providing a quality education for our students. This graph shows the 5-year history of our special education expenditures and the funding source. The light green area of each column represents the amount of federal funding, which is approximately 10%. The dark blue represents the amount of state funding, which is approximately 20%. And the purple represents the amount of local funding each year, which is approximately 70%. For fiscal year 23, the amount of state and federal funding was $7.9 million, and the amount of local funding was $16.9 million. Special education staffing needs continue to grow. This year, the equivalent of 3 teacher FTEs were transferred over to our operating budget from our 6B grant. Additionally, 5 teacher FTEs were created within our Esser grant to support the opening of a self-contained classroom at 2 elementary schools and 1 middle school, along with the creation of a teaching position within our restorative center. 4 special education teacher assistant positions were initially proposed in last year's preliminary budget, but were maintained in the Esser grant. Currently, we have 5 special education teachers and 4 special education aides funded through the Esser 3 grant that we need to transition into the operating fund to continue serving our students. We have also added a pre-K special education classroom this year due to an increase in the number of students eligible for services. Staffing for that classroom includes 1 teacher and 1.5 FTEs for instructional assistants. And at this time, I'm able to answer any questions you may have about the special education slides.
Are there any questions from board members at this point?
Just for the public, when we're looking at the slide that shows above caseload capacity, like high school and we see 7. Can you explain like how do we handle that, please?
Yes, ma'am. So through the regulations governing special ed through Virginia, they have what are called points. And so it's determined based on the amount of services a student receives. So if it's a student receiving services in an inclusion classroom for less than half of the day, that may count as 1 point towards a teacher's caseload. If it is a teacher who's serving a low incidence classroom in a self-contained, one student may count as 2.5 points. And so based on that, there is a maximum. If it is a self-contained teacher, typically it cannot go over serving 10 students in that specific room based on the population, and that could be either less or more depending on what type of disability it is. And in the inclusion classroom, if they're serving less than 50%, 24 points is the maximum that they can serve before we have to start looking at what do we do to support their caseload.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Hunley. Anyone else? Okay, we'll move on then.
With the expiration of the ESSER 3 funds coming up in September 2024, there are several positions across the division that would need to move into the operating fund in order to maintain our current level of service. Those positions include site-based substitutes at each elementary, middle, and high school, as well as preschool. There are 23.5 FTEs across the division. These positions are the first ones to be utilized each day for classroom instruction when teachers are absent. The Restorative Center is currently funded through the Esser grant and will need to be funded in the operating fund to continue supporting students. Positions here include a dean of students, 4 teachers, 2 teacher assistants, and a security officer. In addition, there is 1 security officer funded through Esser at War Hill High School. For the past 2 years, we've received a grant through the Department of Criminal Justice Services that funds a security officer at each of our elementary schools. We must apply for the grant each year and will not know until the spring if we will receive funding for the following year. In order to continue providing these services at our elementary schools, we will need to transition these positions into the operating fund as well. At this time, we don't have any information from New Horizons regarding costs for next year, so we are estimating a 15% increase, which would be approximately $335,000. Virtual Virginia tuition has been paid out of our ESSER grants since COVID, and this expense will need to transition to the operating fund next year, which is approximately $150,000. And currently at this point in the budget process, we are estimating a 10% increase in our workers' compensation, general liability, fleet, and property insurances, which amounts to approximately $75,000. And for our audit contract and risk management services provided by James City County, we are estimating a total increase of $25,000. Utility increases are something that we will need to plan for next year as well. We are estimating an increase of $200,000 is needed in this area based on fiscal year 23 actuals. Contractual increases for operations amount to approximately $25,000, which includes our radio maintenance agreement and ground services with James City County, as well as the annual increase for our storage facility. Beginning in fiscal year 22, we started contracting out some of our transportation services due to the number of driver vacancies, which was partially paid with grant funds. We anticipate the continued need for these services and will need to transition the grant funding into the operating fund next year with the expiration of the ESSER 3 funds coming in September 2024. This amounts to $950,000. Additionally, the trailer leases have been funded the past couple of years with ESSER funds, which will need to transition into the operating fund. This amounts to $220,000. And last summer, we transitioned to a new visitor and emergency management system to enhance the security and safety at our buildings. The annual cost is $84,000. And prior to Mr. Baker sharing preliminary information regarding health care, we were going to pause here to see if there are any questions at this point.
Looking around, any board members have any questions on what you just heard? Anybody? I have a few quick questions. You said we're transitioning the elementary security officers into the operating budget. If we do receive the grant, that money just comes back to us? Is that? Is that correct?
Yeah, if we do receive the grant, then we wouldn't need to include them in the operating fund, but we won't know until.
Right, so this is
like,
just sort of like
just like a
safety.
placeholder, yes, to be able to continue to offer that at our
then
elementary
where
schools.
would those funds from the operating budget go? That would just be decided later?
I guess it depends on when we find out about the grant. If it's before the final approval, then it could be that we would reduce our request or.
Yeah, and of note, the first year of the grant, it was fully funded by the state. The second year, the division had to do a match, and that was based on our LCI, which is our locality's ability to pay. And so we had to use a matching fund for this year to actually use the grant. And we were able to, the county agreed to allow us to use, we had set aside money for safety and security, and so they allowed us to use that money to make the match in this year's budget. That may be a possibility for next year, we don't know, but regardless, there is an expense to the division to keep the security in elementary schools, which is really, really important right now.
And then one additional question, if this is an easy question to answer, if it's not, we can talk about it another time. And I think this is true for everybody in this room. We came onto the school board in the post-Esser fund era. So where were a lot of these Esser fund items prior to that fund being in existence?
A lot of them are new positions. Special education funds, we used Esser funds last year rather than have the locality pay. We used Esser funds, but they are mandated by the state, and so we would have had to add them to the operating budget last year, so we've delayed that a year. The board really wanted to open a restorative centre for students with discipline issues, behaviour management issues, and so we used Esser funds to provide the personnel for that centre. And those were new positions which were not funded in operating last year. There's probably some others as well. The security guards are part of that as well.
Okay, thank you.
Dr. Heron,
Yes, sir.
Yes.
ESSER 3 funds equals how much money?
It was about $11 million in total.
So you're anticipating getting that money, to be granted that money again this year?
No, sir, we were granted it 3 years ago,
3 years ago.
and it had to be spent by
Oh, I see.
September 2024. And unfortunately, with any grant funds, they are one-time funds. They don't go into the operating budget. So we used the funds as much as possible for things that were one-time expenditures. However, we did fund some positions due to necessity out of the grant funds as well. And those this year we're trying to bring into the operating budget. But those actually disappear and have to be spent or lost by September of this year, 24.
Okay.
Anything to add, Ms. Ewing?
I don't think so. I think you covered it.
Thank you.
Good afternoon again.
Okay.
Sure. This slide has information regarding our current $250 deductible plan and is the most popular plan among employees. It does not cost the division any additional money because the employee is paying for the difference or the upgrade. On this plan, for employee only, the employee is paying $230 a month or 24% of the cost. Also on this plan, the employee plus spouse, the employee is paying $616 per month or 35% of the cost. And on this plan for employee plus family, the employee is paying $844 a month or 33% of the cost. And the box on the left-hand side, you can see how many employees take each one of these plans for us. The division offers several health insurance options for our staff. Here you see the current cost share for our $500 deductible plan. And on this plan, for the employee only, the employee is paying $129 a month, or about 15% of the cost. Or for the employee plus spouse, the employee is paying $429 a month, or about 27% of the cost. And for employee plus family, the employee is paying $570 a month, or about 24% of the cost. And again, the numbers of employees that take this option is in the box on the left. We also have the opportunity for a high deductible health plan. And again, those numbers are on the box there on the left. We don't have as many employees choosing this plan because we have other more traditional coverage options at a comparable cost. We added a new option this year, the Centera Health Plan's HMO. And here you see the current cost share for the HMO plan option. And for us, the employee only is paying $89 a month, or about 11% of the cost. An employee plus spouse, the employee is paying $356 a month, or about 24% of the cost. An employee plus family, the employee is paying $447 a month, or about 21% of the cost. On this chart, you can see the historical rate increase over time from 2012 to the present, and to see how we've varied, and there's a slight, obviously, uptick. For this slide, we're using an estimate of 10% as we prepare for our health insurance renewal. Preliminary numbers are typically available later in January or February, and the final numbers will be coming from the local choice shortly thereafter. Currently, the school division is paying 74.4% of the bill, and employees are paying 25.6%. As a reminder, not all employees participate in the health care program. Approximately 1,350 of our employees out of our eligible 1,970 eligible employees participate. That means health insurance differs from a pay raise. If you give a pay raise, it impacts all employees and assists in their retirement. On this last slide, we continue also with a 15% increase in how different cost-sharing scenarios would impact the budget. This slide shows various cost-sharing scenarios for the health insurance between the employer and the employee and WJCC. For example, if WJCC were to absorb 50% of a 15% increase, that would increase the budget by $1,916,453. We also show a 60-40 share as well as a 70-30 share with both a 15% increase and a 10% increase. I'll now hand it back to our CFO.
I'm sorry.
Is-
you have a
I have a
question?
question. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Is there a formula or something of how you determine the percentages that the school system would pay as opposed to the employees for each of the different insurance
For
areas?
us,
I guess I'm trying to figure out like why it's different
because
throughout.
for the employee, your portion would, so if the, like the example we gave for, on this one, for employee only, on the left-hand side, the bar in the middle, the $724, that is what James City County School Division pays for that employee. We pay the same if you're taking the HMO. We pay the same if you're taking the $500 deductible plan. We pay the same if you're taking the $250 deductible plan. So even though those other plans potentially cost more, it doesn't cost the school division any more money because the employee is paying for that upgrade. They say, I value having the $250 deductible plan, and they're willing to take that increased cost on.
Any other questions? Okay, Ms. Ewing?
Okay. So as we look at a summary of the expenditures that we've gone through this afternoon, the cost of a salary increase is approximately $1.2 million for each percentage increase. At this time, there is no salary increase included in the governor's budget, only a 1% bonus payment, which would cost $1 million. Increased cost for health insurance based on a 15% overall increase, and the division covering 70% of that increased cost is approximately $2.7 million. Essential increases in FTEs for teachers based on our target ratios is $160,000. Mandatory increases in FTEs for special education teachers and aides is approximately $665,000. Site-based substitutes transitioning from Esser 3 amounts to $753,000. Restorative center positions amount to $590,000. And security officers for War Hill and the elementary schools amount to $415,000. Contractual services increases amount to approximately 1.3 million, and estimated increases for workers' compensation, general liability, and property insurances is approximately 75,000. The estimated amount for New Horizons and Virtual Virginia tuition is 485,000, and the utilities 200,000. Total expenditure increases range from 9.5 million to 11.9 million, depending upon salary increases. As a point of reference, this chart represents our local revenue for the past 10 years. Years with an asterisk indicate the first year of a biennium. Fiscal year 19 has a higher increase, as that is the year that James Blair opened, so we have not factored that year into the average increase information that is presented. The percentage increase over these years, not including fiscal year 19, has ranged from a low of 1.6% to a high of 5.4%, with the average being 2.6%. And this chart shows what various locality increases would amount to, ranging from 2.5% at 2.5 million to a 5% increase at 5.1 million over our fiscal year 24 budget. And for comparison purposes, this chart shows for the past 10 years the percentage increase each year for both our local revenue, represented by the red line, and the state revenue, represented by the blue line. For most years, our local revenue has been around 2%, with a few exceptions, most notably in fiscal year 19, again when James Blair opened. Again, this is a preliminary look at what is included in the governor's introduced budget. We are hopeful that we have detailed information to share at the next budget work session. We have also only reviewed mandatory and essential cost increases to maintain current service levels this afternoon. There are other cost increases and potential savings that will be reviewed at the January 16th budget work session. Upcoming dates in the budget process include a budget work session and a pre-budget public comment on January 16th. Presentation of the superintendent's proposed budget on February 20th, a public hearing on March 5th. There will be a joint budget work session with our funding partners on March 15th, with anticipated board approval on March 22nd in order to submit our budget request to the localities by April 1st. And that concludes our presentation. We'd be happy to answer any questions that you may have.
All right, Mrs. Hundley?
I do have one more question. I'm sorry, I should have asked. We have 16 vacancies. Of the 16, how many are special ed teachers, and does that affect the caseloads? I guess, yeah, I was just curious.
Dr. Brown may be able to talk to that, Mr. Baker, as he will probably know the openings in special education right now. Dr. Brown?
So I can't speak to the current amount of vacancies. Mr. Baker can do that. In terms of a vacancy within the school, we either, within our department, look within that school to determine are other teachers underneath their capacity and can provide caseload management for those students. We've also, through the RFP process, have contracted services as well that we've utilized throughout this year for teachers.
For reference, for new board members, this is the first time we've had to contract for special education teachers because we couldn't get enough to fill the positions and serve students as we are required to. And we've also contracted for other special services such as speech pathology and other areas as well where we were unable to hire people to fill the positions. And contracted services, by their very nature, cost more than actually employing someone. So those positions are advertised. We're still trying to hire people, but meanwhile we've got to fulfill the services for students.
And currently, 2 of those positions are special ed positions of the current vacancies.
Anybody else? We have time.
Lots of time.
Question.
Mr. Riffle?
I guess looking at the total number of expenditures, what would be like an ideal state assistance to help with this gap, I guess, because I don't think the localities can cover this much in an annual year.
Well, I think the governor's proposed budget was a little bit disappointing in that there was a zero increase in salary for teachers in particular and for staff in general. As you've realized, hiring and keeping teachers right now is a huge challenge for the school division and every school division in the state of Virginia and across the country. So with a zero increase in salary, that will be an issue going into next year for sure. The bonus is great, but it's a one-time. It doesn't add to retirement. We don't know what to expect. I think our biggest hope would be the 2-year process of rebenchmarking. And from what we understand with current salaries, it's rebenchmarking is based on the average salary. And as Mrs. Ewing mentioned earlier, the average salary is going up from 50 something to 60.
One example was 53,996 to 61,000, which was about a 14% increase when I compared that.
So that will mean a certain number of dollars, but we don't know yet because we don't have the calc tools. So we could see a flow of dollars with the rebenchmarking, which will help a little bit towards this. The state has stepped up to the mark significantly in the last 2 years, but they still have a long way to go. You may be aware of the most recent JLARC study on K-12 funding. It's worth reading. I think it's a time when we as an organisation and together as a board and superintendent, it's a time for advocacy for public funding, state funding of public education. Because you're right, our localities won't be able to meet completely our needs.
I guess like another follow-up would be, on January 16th, could we get maybe more of a flushed out what our board needs from the state? And then, because I think we're going through the state budgetary process, and if we don't kind of make that more aware when we get to the point where they're actually amending the budget or doing those type of things, we won't see it until it's like basically past our budget, right? So, and that's why I'm asking is like, there's ways to go about this process that like kind of make it more it's not as transparent for the public, but more of like people can do more advocacy if we have more awareness of what's necessary, right?
Absolutely, and I think last year we did produce a document advocating for additional funds. We took it to our legislative representatives within our community. We presented it to them. The Capital Conference is coming up in a couple of weeks. Madam Vice Chair, if you want to speak to that.
Yeah, that's the conference we're attending in Richmond, and so that's where we'll hear legislative priorities from VSBA, and then ideally we'll be setting up meetings with our legislators, and that will be the point of that, to advocate for funding that we need.
I think one of the benefits of a divided government is that it leaves room for advocacy for what we need is in public education. And I think there is a moment in time when we really have to do that, and it's actually now. And so as a school division, we need to advocate for a salary inclusion increase in the current budget. There's a process going to work through the General Assembly. I'm sure there'll be lots of debate about what to include and change in the governor's budget. That's the normal process. But there is a moment in time, which is right now, as this process starts, to intervene and advocate strongly for, one, an increase in salaries above zero. I don't think 7% is realistic, which we've made big gains in the last couple of years, but I think there's a time for a normalization of an increase in salary, which generally is 1 or 2 to 3%. Zero is not good in terms of teacher morale and staff morale. We should also advocate continuously for the removal of the support cap. We employ a lot of positions within the organisation that the locality pays for. If that support cap is taken away in the General Assembly as part of the SOQ funding, then that will bring money to us as well that we can use for some of our needs. There's other things as well, and really want to spend some time in talking with you as a board as to where your priorities might be, so that as staff we can help produce the information you need to advocate for us.
I was going to say thank you for that, and I look forward to seeing the document.
And as a follow-on to what I think you were getting at, it is a little bit of a frustrating process that we have to submit our budget to our locality, whether the General Assembly has given us any indication of what they plan to do. I mean, you saw, was it last year? We didn't know till October. So we have deadlines that are independent from the General Assembly.
I'm very aware. I just wanted to express that. It's more to the public, like what we're doing on like this large deficit that we're maybe potentially going to have to not fund or fund, right? So that's what I'm saying. So,
And I think what's important about tonight is this is maintaining services. We're not adding anything right now tonight. We've gone through a process where every department has expressed their additional needs. There's been requests for additional staffing across the whole division that we haven't even talked about yet. As a leadership team, we are working through those diligently to determine what really is an extreme need, because this year we want to focus on bringing positions in from the Esser grants. So there's lots of need being expressed outside of this that may never reach this table, or a very limited amount of it. We're also going through, Ms. Ewan currently is starting tomorrow, starting to pull department budgets, school budgets, looking at money spent over the last 5 years, money allocated, money spent, to look for savings in every single possible place to begin to meet some of this need ourselves, as well as ask for what we still need. So we're going through a very detailed process and really trying to be fiscally responsible as we go through that.
Mrs. Donner?
For the viewing public and also for new board members, as we look on slide 44, which shows the potential ask of an increase between 9.5 and the 12 million, and then slide 46, which shows potential funding increases from the localities, and there's sort of that delta. I think as I sat through this last year, is that part of to the whole conversation around advocacy is that when you're looking at estimated costs, right, we're projecting in here taking on the whole 1.2 to 3.6 million to increase compensation. And so if there were additional dollars from the state, that would help to offset and bring that delta down. I know last year the health insurance was also a big question about how much that increase would be. And so that's another place where that delta might change and hopefully come down if it's not on the high end of the 15%. And so just as we're thinking and having our conversations with our respective funding partners around the places where we see some wiggle room, and as Dr. Heron is saying, that these are all needs and things that are already in place that we're continuing, that it's not an ad.
Right. So lots of work still to be done. If Madam Vice Chair, if I may, the health insurance, we won't know the increase. We hope by next meeting, but more often it's been early February before we have a final number. So we'll be bringing at the next meeting some possibilities for change in our healthcare in terms of sharing the burden of that expense. We are 70-30. We shared the increase. The division took on 70% last year and passed 30% of that increase on to employees. We're looking at the overall cost share, not just the increase. And we need to look at potentially a surcharge for spouses included in the insurance. Many divisions don't allow spouses to be included in insurance if they have an option elsewhere. Others have a surcharge of anything from $50 to $350. Ours currently is $75. So we're going to look at all of the options and really ask for your consideration and input as we work through the process. Mr. Baker made a comment earlier, I'm not sure if you picked it up or not. When we give an increase in salary, everyone gets it. When we impact health insurance and pay more of that, only those who take our health insurance benefit from that. And so we need to grapple with that and decide where we want to be as an organization this year as well.
Any other thoughts? Yeah, Mrs. Donner?
One other question.
Yeah.
I believe at our last board meeting, we were looking at, I think it was either the support positions, or just that there were some places where we might need to do, let me rephrase this. When we're looking at some of the support positions, the hourlies, like those we're looking at in terms of increases of $1, $2 as wholes, not as percentages. And then in terms of those who are salaried, those are the places where we're looking at percentage increases of the 1%, 2%, and 3%. Correct. So like if it's $1, if you're making $17 an hour, $1.50 increase is slightly below like a 8%-ish increase. So you might be getting larger percentage increases on some of our hourly positions than on some of our salary positions. So we look at this.
That's correct. And the information's presented tonight by Mr. Baker. Those are the grade levels and positions where we have a lot of vacancies right now. And even looking at the numbers tonight as you review those before our next meeting, some are obviously of more urgency than others. So we may not be able to make the changes at all grade levels and all positions. We may have to dissect and do what we can in this fiscal year as well. Custodial staff, bus drivers are two of our greatest areas of need.
Go ahead.
One other question along there, I believe as some of the teachers have expressed some of their frustrations around having to do duties that are, getting the kids on and off the bus, or having to give up teaching period, or having to give up their planning periods because they have to cover a class. I was just wondering if investment in certain of these positions, such as teaching assistants or those, is making investments there and being able to hire and fill those positions. Does that help alleviate some of the stress on the teachers having to do some of those extra duties?
Potentially, yes. Yeah, absolutely. Although the vacancies in the teacher assistants are not as great as in the other, Mr. Baker, I don't know if you want to speak to that. There is a need, absolutely, but it's not as great. We have been able to fill a significant number, but not all. I think mostly in special education aides, I think, are one of the hardest to fill.
Yes, ma'am. Most of the positions, as we said on the support scales, were like 35 cafeteria workers. And most of them are cafeteria workers, bus aides. There's a few teacher assistants, probably about a half dozen, but most of the positions on the support that we were mentioning were cafeteria workers, bus aides, and a few bus drivers.
Does special education teaching assistants, do they get paid slightly differently or more than those that are in the regular classroom, or in a self-contained classroom? Or
No, not necessarily.
is that a area in which, like, it's because it's harder? Is that a place, like, how do you think about that in terms of scale and attracting
Yeah, I
folks?
think we pay them differently depending on education right now, but we did offer a stipend, I believe, last year. Dr. Brown, if you want to speak to that, that would be great.
Yep, we do have stipends for teacher assistants serving in classrooms that require more intensive needs, and so that was passed through in the last budget, and last year was the first time we distributed that out. So that was one way to support those teacher assistants who are having to provide an increased level of service to meet the needs. So.
I have a quick question. Do we have a sense for those areas where you said we have the greatest need, those positions? Do we have a sense that even localities that are maybe able to pay more are having similar issues, or are they fully staffed? I mean, is it? Do we think it's really just pay, or is it just across the board?
I think there are vacancies across the board in many of those positions. I don't know how we compare with others, but we can certainly try to get some of that information.
As I talk to my counterparts in other divisions, they're all facing similar challenges we are too.
So even those that maybe are already offering $1 or $2 more, are they facing similar vacancies?
I think maybe a little bit less. So I think they're still facing some of the challenges. I think it's like bus drivers across the United States.
Right.
There's a shortage. Period.
Right. It's just a matter, right? People
Yes,
just
ma'am.
don't want to do the job.
Well, it's a challenging job, and it's also it's a unique job that it's a few hours in the morning, a break, a few hours in the afternoon, and it's only the 180 days.
Right.
And for the benefit of the board, bus drivers, we actually upgraded. We put it up a grade in terms of position last year for bus drivers to raise the salary. But again, when you saw the information tonight, we are not even remotely competitive right now. And so a bus driver living in Williamsburg can drive to Newport News and make more for the same job.
And that's a question I was going to have, and I'm glad you raised it. Is I guess is there a historical reason why Williamsburg, James City County is that much lower than our neighbors?
I think there's been increasing salary increases in other divisions that have outpaced ours right now, and therefore the gap has become bigger over the last couple of years because everyone's putting emphasis on where they need it, raising salaries, and then others are raising salaries. So it's, and even with WADA in our local community, we raise it, WADA raises it, and people will move backwards and forwards. It's very competitive to get good people to do the job.
Are there other thoughts, questions? Just clarification for anything you heard tonight for new members, if you just don't know what an acronym is or anything. I don't want you to feel like you can't ask, but yeah. Looks like everyone's pretty good.
Just one final comment. As you go through the information, there's a lot of information. If there's questions that you want to send to me, then we will work as staff to get those answers. We do have a process called School Board Questions, SBQs, where you ask questions and then we provide the answer to every single board member so that we're all kept fully informed. So anything you want to know or you think might be helpful for you as we try to look at our options as moving forward with the budget, please ask, and then we can provide those to you before the next meeting.
Yeah. I'll say at this point in the process, it is helpful to Dr. Herron and to her staff to hear your questions and your thoughts and what, you know, whether it's a brand new board member question or something that, you know, digging down deeper into the numbers or, you know, why do we prioritize this over this? I think they're soliciting input now this early in the process, so we would like, you know, to hear your thoughts and questions moving forward.
And also, we have to remember our LCI is higher, so Newport News, Hampton, they get more federal funding than we do.
Or state,
So, state funding, so a lot of times that's one of the reasons why we lag so far behind.
That too.
And the challenging piece of that, Mrs. Connolly, is that our locality is supposed to be able to pay more. That's what the LCI is telling us as a community, that we should be able to support education more, and they do, and they support us very well. I mean, our first point is advocacy of the state, as hard as we can make it. And then we may be in a position to be advocating more from our community as well.
This may be kind of an aside, but there's been all these conversations about a splitting between Williamsburg and James City County. That's got to have an effect on the budget if that happens.
Yeah, it's hard to measure right now, Dr. Cavazos. I do believe we'll be having reports on where we are on that fairly soon. The city of Williamsburg has done a study, as has James City County, and that will be budget-driven, position-driven, what it's going to look like for each locality if we were not a joint system. And yes, I think it will have an impact on both. Absolutely, sir.
But if that were to occur, that would not impact the budget we're currently looking at. So for purposes of this discussion in these coming weeks, that is not a topic that influences our budget process at the moment.
No, I understand, but I mean, it's got to be in the back of people's minds that this could happen. I mean,
Absolutely. I mean, it could impact staffing. It could impact
buildings.
buildings. Yeah, at the building level. However, from my understanding, we will have those reports, and the intent of both entities is that we would not split if we were to split until 2028, to allow for the building of a middle school. But that is all still to be determined. And as I find out more information, obviously I'll keep you informed as well.
All right, well, we are quite ahead of schedule, I believe, so
Absolutely.
it's not a bad thing necessarily, but I just want to make clear, don't hold back if you do have questions or be something you would like to ask now. But I also Yeah. Anything else from you, Ms. Ewing or Dr. Herron? No?
I believe that's all we have for this evening.
Take a break then? All right.
Absolutely.
Well, then this budget meeting is adjourned.